The Seventh Tower by Garth Nix. Book 4. Above the Veil. Chapter 4. They were only a dozen stretches from the dock when the underfolk noticed them. It was Crow who glanced across the water, alerted by a splash. Shock flicked across his face, but it was gone in an instant as he shouted and grabbed his spear. "Look out! In the water!" The other two underfolk on the dock went for their spears as well, while the two in the water splashed in a panic to the steps. Weed went flying through the air as the underfolk threw it aside in their haste to get weapons or get out of the water. "Peace!" shouted Mila. "A truce!" "Talk!" shouted Tal. "We just want to talk!" Unfortunately, Adris decided at the same moment that he would help with a thunder shout. It broke across the water with all the strength of real thunder, drowning out everyone's words and momentarily stunning the underfolk. As the thunder echoed through the pool, Crow threw his spear straight at Tal. Mila leapt forward and snatched it out of the air. Tal fell into the water, up to his neck, but he kept his hand and sunstone ring above the surface. Suddenly angry, all his thoughts focused on bringing forth blinding brilliance. Light exploded out of the stone, banishing the darkness. Adris and Audris roared with delight, suddenly visible as hard-edged shadows, huge, human-like figures of billowing cloud. They rushed at the other underfolk, who threw their spears uselessly at the spirit shadows. Adris and Audris batted them away. It looked like a full-scale battle was about to develop when Mila shouted, using the voice that she had been trained to use aboard an ice ship at the height of a gale. "Stop! Everybody stop!" Everybody stopped. They might have started again if Mila hadn't kept on shouting. "Adris! Audris! Come back here! You underfolk, stay where you are! We just want to talk! We're not chosen!" Tal dragged himself up from the water, pushing the weed off his shoulders. He kept his sunstone burning bright, but deflected the light off the distant ceiling so it didn't blind anybody. "It's them," said one of the underfolk, a tall, blonde-haired boy. No, girl, who Tal suddenly remembered was called Gil. "The two we dragged up here from Audit 3. I told you we should have killed them." "Close it," said Crow. He was looking at Tal and Mila, but his eyes kept shooting across at Adris and Audris. He had a knife in his hand, held low at his side. "We aren't chosen," repeated Mila. She ignored Tal's furious look at her. She might not be chosen, but he was, and he couldn't see any point in pretending otherwise. "No?" asked Crow. "You have sunstones and spirit shadows." "I am Mila, an Icecarl, from outside the castle. Tal used to be a chosen, but he's not anymore. The chosen have cast him out. The guards are after him." Tal opened his mouth to protest, then shut it again. Mila was describing what had happened to him in her terms, but it was still true. He was effectively an outcast. He hadn't really thought it through before. Crow listened without changing his expression. Even the news that Mila came from outside the castle didn't seem to perturb him. The others shifted nervously and looked behind them to the open door and the tunnel beyond. "We're looking for my great-uncle Ebbet," said Tal. "An old chosen. His spirit shadow has the shape of a Maine cat. Have you seen him down here?" "Maybe," said Crow. Tal noticed that the other underfolk seemed to recognize Ebbet's name, and they wouldn't meet his eyes. It was also clear Crow was their leader, and they would stand silently while he did the talking. "Can you take us to him?" asked Mila. "That depends, doesn't it?" said Crow. "On what?" Tal asked. He was getting more and more angry. Why don't you just do as you're told?" Even as the words left his mouth, Tal regretted them. This was exactly how he'd gotten in trouble with the Icecarls. His mind knew better, but it was slower than his tongue. Crow stared at him, his dark eyes shining with a deep hatred. "You're still a chosen, aren't you?" he said, raising his knife. "Do this, do that. We're not your servants down here. We're free folk, not underfolk. And you can wander around down here like little lost light puppets until the guard gets you, as far as I'm concerned." Tal raised his sunstone, his mind concentrating on a red ray of destruction. If Crow sprang at him or tried to throw the knife, he would unleash it. Crow saw the red light swirling around the stone and hesitated. Before either of them decided to break the momentary stalemate, Mila sloshed between them and looked up at the underfolk on the dock. "There should be no fighting between us when the real enemy is close," she said. "Afterward, when the storm is done, we can settle scores." Crow stared down at her, the fury still obvious in his face. It looked like he was going to attack anyway, until one of the other underfolk sidled over and whispered something to him. "Close it, Clovel," said Crow, pushing the other boy, hard enough that he fell over a barrel and into a pile of seaweed. "All right, I'll say it so everyone can hear," shouted Clovel. He was angry now, too, as he clambered out of the seaweed. "We've orders to bring anyone who wants to see Ebbet to—" "Close it," Crow repeated, but he seemed to have lost the heat of his anger, for there was no strength in his words. "So you do know Ebbet," said Mila, "and there is someone who gives you orders. Lead us to your crone." "I'll what?" asked Gil, as Crow frowned and did not answer. "Whoever is in charge," Tal explained. He'd managed to calm himself down, and was remembering his first introduction to Mila and the Ice Carls. Obviously these free folk weren't normal underfolk, and couldn't be treated like them. He'd have to be more polite. He'd learned at least that out on the ice. "I'm sorry about what I said," Tal added, looking at Crow. Crow stared at him, expressionless. There was no knowing what thoughts lay behind those unblinking eyes. Tal didn't know whether his apology was accepted or not. "Clovel, Ferric," Crow ordered, "lead out. We'll go via Forge Country and across Holding Tank 4. "4?" asked Ferric. He was a small and seemingly nervous boy. He twitched as he spoke. Tal had seen that sort of twitch before. Ferric must have spent time in the Hall of Nightmares. "I said Forge Country and Holding Tank 4, snapped Crow. "Do I have to repeat every order?" "Only the stupid ones," muttered Gil, too soft for anyone but Mila to hear. The Ice Carl glanced at the girl, who was surprised to have been heard. She scowled and looked away. Mila and Tal climbed out of the water and onto the dock, their spirit shadows rising up close behind them. The underfolk stepped back, unconsciously forming a line. "As I said, I am Mila of the Far Raiders clan of the Ice Carls. What are your names?" The underfolk all looked at Crow, who shrugged. Evidently this was permission. Even so, it took a moment before they mumbled their names. "I'm Gil," said the blonde girl. Like all of them, she wore a mixture of underfolk white robes and odd bits and pieces. In her case, that included the belt from a blue Bright Star, though the belt was so dirty it could be black instead of blue. She needed it because she was so skinny. Up close, Tal saw that her white underfolk robes had crude writing on them, as did all the others. He had to crane his head sideways before he could work out that it was the letter F from the standard chosen alphabet, repeated over and over. "It stands for free folk," said Clovel, who had seen what Tal was doing. "Free of the chosen. It shows who we are, to separate us from the fatalists." "The fatalists?" asked Tal. That starts with F, too." "But they don't have writing on their robes," Clovel explained. "You mean the regular underfolk?" Crow made a cutting movement with his hand, and Clovel didn't answer. Tal didn't press it. There was still a lot of tension in the air. "You are called Clovel?" asked Mila, when no one else introduced themselves. Clovel nodded. He still had seaweed on his shoulders. He was almost as tall as Crow, and from the way he'd behaved before, it looked like he thought he should be in charge. His long sandy hair was held back by a comb made from a large white bone. Possibly a human one, though the underfolk kept all sorts of livestock for the chosen's tables, so it could easily have come from an animal. "And you are Ferric," continued Mila, pointing at the twitching small boy. He nodded and smiled eagerly. Crow frowned at him, and the smile disappeared. Apart from Crow, that left a single stout girl, who had stood silently by the whole time. Unlike the others, she wore a heavy hide apron over her underfolk robes, and had a large number of pouches hanging from her belt. "That's Inky," said Gil. Inky nodded to them. There was no explanation of why she didn't talk. "I am Audris," said Audris, after another momentary pause. As the spirit shadow spoke, all the underfolk, even Crow, jumped in surprise, and Ferric stepped back, shaking uncontrollably as if he had a sudden fever. "What?" asked Audrus, looking at Mila and Tal. All I said was my name. Spirit shadows don't usually talk to anyone but their masters, in private, said Tal. He'd become so used to Adris and Audrus talking away that he'd forgotten this was yet another way in which the Storm Shepherds were different from other spirit shadows. Audrus and Adris are not normal chosen spirit shadows, explained Tal to the Underfolk. They are, friends, I suppose, rather than, servants. Mila didn't say anything. She was looking back across the lake, into the darkness. Lights had flared there, a sudden show of distant flashes and stars. There was also the very faint echo of shouts. The guards, she said urgently. They found us. We have to move quickly. Right, said Crow. Like I said, through Forge Country and then across Holding Tank 4. Clovel, Ferric, you lead. The two named Underfolk ran along the dock to a door in the cavern wall and slipped through it. After you, said Crow to Tal and Mila, gesturing for them to go first. Mila shook her head. No, she said evenly. We will follow you. Crow stared for a moment, then shrugged and left, followed by the other Underfolk. On the way, he picked up a long strand of the weed, one with very large nodules, and hung it over his shoulder. Gil and Inky did the same. Mila and Tal waited till the free folk were well in front before they followed. Nothing was said, but both Mila and Tal didn't want Crow behind them.